Several of you had questions on the three-term contingency question, so I made this brief video um, to describe that and to tell you a little bit more about it. Hopefully we'll come to some understanding. In Pavlovian conditioning, remember that we start with a reflex relation, that is a stimulus-response relationship, or what we say is that we have an unconditional stimulus that elicits an unconditional response, or we say the US elicits the UR. This relationship is built into the organism, into the species. Um, it can be seen in a lot of species, but it's not a learned response. This is an unconditional response. It's a response without conditions. It occurs without conditions. Getting dust in your eye, gagging on an object in your throat, grasping a finger, kicking when your foot is tickled after you're born. Those sorts of things are all reflexes. Um, Those reflexes are elicited by an unconditional stimulus. Now, if we have this US-UR relationship, if we were to present a novel stimulus prior to the unconditional stimulus, which elicits the unconditional response, and if we were to do this repeatedly, if we were to do this, a neutral stimulus, then the US, which elicits the UR, what comes to happen is that the novel stimulus or the neutral stimulus becomes a conditional stimulus that elicits a conditional response even in the absence of the US. The CS elicits a new response, or the conditioned response, even in the absence of the unconditional stimulus. So that's Pavlovian conditioning. Okay, the conditional stimulus comes to elicit a conditional response. The CS elicits the CR. Now notice the response in this arrangement, the behaviors, if you're looking at the behavior, cannot be specified. The response, the unconditional and the conditional response, are what you get. You get what you get. If you elicit a response, the response is what you get. You can't specify what response you want. So, while existing behavior may be brought under the control of new stimuli, new behavior cannot be taught. Okay, Pavlov didn't teach his dogs to salivate. He taught them to salivate when a bell rang. He taught them to salivate conditional upon the presentation of a bell. But he didn't teach them any new or novel behavior. He just brought what was existing under the control of new environmental stimuli. So we can talk about this as a contingency, though. A synonym for contingency is dependency. Pavlovian conditioning does involve a contingency. There are two terms. There's a dependency or a contingency between the CS and the US. And remember, we gotta keep in mind that a US is defined by its effects. It is a stimulus that elicits a UR. If the stimulus doesn't elicit any response, it's not an unconditional stimulus. Now here, in this relationship, the directionality is key. The CS comes and then the CR comes after it. The stimulus comes first, the response comes next. What if a response produces a stimulus? And it almost always does. A response produces some change in the environment. Something else happens in the environment when behavior occurs. This is also a two-term contingency or dependency. But this one is turned opposite. Now a response is producing a stimulus rather than a stimulus producing a response. If you press a button, your computer comes on. That's your response producing some environmental change or some stimulus. Now, if the stimulus, in this case, has an effect on the probability of that response in the future, the law of effect here is what we're talking about. Then we're talking about operant conditioning. We call it the law of effect because the stimulus has an effect on the response. Operant conditioning is when the stimulus, or what is produced, or the consequence that is produced by a response, feeds back onto the future likelihood of that response that produced it under or in similar conditions. Okay, so what we start with is behavior stimulus relationship, or what we call this a behavior consequence relationship. Now, this is a two-term contingency. However, invariably, almost in all conditions, near all situations, what we see is that there are usually reliable situations or events that precede this two-term contingency. We call this a discriminative stimulus. The discriminative stimulus, what we say is it sets the occasion for a behavior to produce a particular consequences. We also talk about the ABCs of operant behavior, and we replace discriminative stimulus with the term antecedent. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. What comes before the behavior, and then the consequence of that behavior. So sometimes in applied behavior analysis you might hear about an ABC analysis or the ABCs of behavior, and what they're talking about is a three-term contingency or a three-term contingency analysis. The discriminative stimulus, or the SD we sometimes abbreviate it as, sets the occasion for a particular response to produce a particular consequence. Note that it does not elicit a response. We say it sets the occasion for it, sets the table for something to happen. We say that it evokes a response. It doesn't goad it, doesn't pull it out, it doesn't force it like in Pavlovian conditioning or in a reflex. So what we wind up with is this three-term contingency. Discriminative stimulus, or SD, sets the occasion for a response to produce some consequence. This is the three-term contingency. Now, I'd like to even introduce something else, and that is that why is this such an important thing? What makes this an important event or change? What makes a consequence an important event? And in fact, sometimes consequences are important and sometimes they're not. It just is the nature of the world. So we have a technical term for that, and that is what we call now an establishing operation. So I think the three-term contingency actually needs a fourth term, and that is what we call establishing or motivating operations. And these are operations or manipulations that potentiate a class of events as important consequences. They make a consequence of behavior important to that organism. So for example, walking through the desert makes water a reinforcer. Getting a cut makes a band-aid a reinforcer. Drinking too much the night before makes your alarm a punisher. Reinforcers and punishers, we'd call those consequences. These sorts of events make these sorts of consequences important to a particular organism. Sometimes water is not a reinforcer. Sometimes a band-aid is not a reinforcer. What makes a band-aid a reinforcer? Getting cut. What makes water a reinforcer? Not having water for a long while, or exercising, or walking through a desert, or losing a lot of blood, for example. Those are all things that potentiate water as a reinforcer. Water isn't always a reinforcer. Your alarm may be a punisher or reinforcer depending on what happened the night before or what you have going on in the morning. So again, what makes certain events reinforcers or punishers, what makes events important consequences, those operations, those processes, we call motivating or establishing operations. Now notice these are observable, in principle, processes and events. We're not appealing to some intervening variable like motivation or drive. We're talking about them in very observable and manipulable ways. These are experiments that we can do then, demonstrate that getting a cut makes a band-aid a reinforcer, and so on. Hopefully that helps with three-term contingency. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.